Hi, Jamie Cowan here, and I want to talk to you today about the odd convergence of evangelical Christianity and conservative politics. Now, I want to begin by saying that I'm a moderate conservative. I worked in Republican politics from an early age, and until 2016, I voted consistently Republican for president for 40 years. So, in my following remarks, I make no value judgments about conservative politics or the Republican Party. With those caveats, I turn now to evangelical Christianity. If there's one thing that's critical about evangelical Christianity, it's about the promotion of the gospel. The gospel is the good news that Jesus is the Messiah and that he inaugurated the kingdom of God on the earth. The picture of the kingdom of God comes from the prophets, where the wolf will lie down with the lamb. Swords will be beaten into plowshares, and every one will sit under his own vine and his own fig tree. In other words, the spread of the kingdom of God brings transformative change to society, peace, justice, and prosperity for all. Now, let's consider a few historical impacts of the gospel spread upon society. I want to begin with the Wesleyan Revival, which occurred in the mid-18th century in England through the Wesley brothers. Thousands upon thousands turned to God, ultimately resulting in widespread societal change, including the abolitionist movement, which resulted in the abolition of slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the institution of child labor laws, limitations on work hours, and prison reform. Turning to the First Great Awakening in the United States in the mid-18th century, which was an extension of the Wesleyan Revival from England, it actually contributed to the American Revolution. Its focus was on having personal encounters between God and man, and it actually led to increased voices for personal liberty against oppressive rule of government. Then there was the Second Great Awakening in the United States, early to mid-19th century, which led to the abolitionist movement in the United States. Then the Civil War, and then finally the abolition of slavery in the 1860s. And then there was the Third Great Awakening, again in the United States, from between mid to late 19th century, which resulted in the temperance movement against alcoholism and ultimately women's suffrage. And finally, the civil rights movement led by African American pastors like Martin Luther King, Fred Shuttlesworth, and others, albeit this was not necessarily a religious-inspired movement. With that history, it's odd that evangelical Christianity converged with conservative politics beginning in the late 1970s. You see, the very nature of conservatism is for things to either not change or to change very slowly. But the gospel actually creates radical changes, usually and always in people, but often in society. Traditional conservative politics in the United States has been associated with limited government with respect to its involvement in private economic and social affairs. And until the 1970s, religion and religious issues were very rarely its focus. For most of the 20th and 21st centuries, conservative politics was associated with the Republican Party. Then in the 1960s, which is the era in which I grew up, we saw sweeping cultural changes and phenomena. The civil rights laws were enacted to eliminate Jim Crow barriers to the integration of African Americans into society. There was widespread opposition to the Vietnam War, leading to massive anti-war protests. Women entered into the workforce like never before, dramatically changing the culture of the American family. Abortion rights came to the forefront. And the 1968 presidential election was a watershed. Richard Nixon, which was the Republican candidate for president, campaigned on a law and order platform. It was the perfect antidote for the upheaval in the United States following the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the disastrous Democratic convention in Chicago during the convention, and the rioting of African Americans in the spring and summer of 1968 following the Martin Luther King assassination. Conservative political activists of the Republican Party saw an open door into the southern states, which were traditionally Democratic because of the passage of civil rights acts under the Democratic administrations. They specifically targeted white evangelical churches in the South. Up to this point, evangelical leaders, had not really been involved in politics. However, following the desegregation of public schools, many Christian schools in the South had established themselves to be separate from the rest of society, and now they were being subjected to the very same civil rights laws. Many of the evangelical leaders felt it was a time to organize politically, and it coalesced around Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. Jerry Falwell at that time was the pastor of Liberty Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. In the mid-1970s, Falwell toured the country holding big rallies challenging the changing culture of America. He energized white evangelicals everywhere. And in 1979, he organized an evangelical response to cultural change. That organization's name became known as the Moral Majority. Its goal was, quote, to return America to its Christian foundations. Its focus was on abortion, divorce, feminism, and gay rights. In the 1980 presidential election, the Moral Majority threw its support behind Republican candidate Ronald Reagan against then-President Jimmy Carter, despite the fact that Carter had proclaimed for the first time in presidential history that he was born again, the watchword phrase of the evangelical movement. Carter, as he explained it, was opposed to extending private moral issues into public policy. The irony was that the Moral Majority converged with political conservatism, which traditionally wanted to limit government intervention into private affairs. Now the goal was to dramatically expand government regulation and, in many cases, prohibition of certain behaviors. As more evangelical Christian political organizations formed, there became an increasing amalgamation of traditional conservatism with an activist social agenda. Now, in the past, the repercussions of revival always led to progressive political change to make society more equitable, as I explained earlier. But this new religious political movement was a more regressive attempt to return to a time period from the past. Now today, there certainly are social issues that should concern people of faith, such as abortion and sexual identity. But many of the evangelical political organization platforms also include issues such as national security, immigration, limited government with the exception of social issues, appointment of conservative judges, education, gun rights, most of which have little or nothing to do with biblical values. The classic arguments used today by evangelical leaders is to scare voters into believing that if they don't vote Republican, the country will somehow become socialistic and confiscate everyone's guns. But honestly, I'm not sure how those issues relate to faith in God. Now, and I'm not arguing pro or con for either issue. I'm just asking why evangelical leaders even care. The reality is the gospel spread in the first 2.5 centuries in the Roman Empire that was pagan, oppressive, and autocratic. Jesus said nothing about government institutions or politics, with the exception of challenging the hypocrisy of religious leaders, which should be a warning to evangelical leaders in this age. And with respect to guns, yes, the Second Amendment to the Constitution protects the right of private ownership of guns, but what does that have to do with the gospel? Come on, as I said in earlier messages, the followers of Yeshua should be engaged in promoting a just society by speaking truth to power and challenging unjust policies, not just for the unborn, but also for the poor, the marginalized, the immigrants, and minority groups. Historically, the gospel transformed society into a better and more equitable one. The gospel should not be used to further a political agenda and certainly not a political party. Rather, the gospel changes lives, and those lives transform society. Let's use the turmoil of the present day to focus on the meaningful. As the prophet Isaiah said, preach the good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. You see, that's the gospel that I'm familiar with. I hope you agree. Thank you, and see you next time.